I have said this before, that the word love for me is probably one of the most overused and abused words in the English language. And I actually think we should just throw it out and start all over again. Now, to be clear, I don't think we should throw out the concept of love. I'm not some disgruntled old codger who no longer believes that love is not possible. But rather, I'm the opposite. The word has become so used and abused by people who apply it to all kinds of things that aren't love, or in fact even the opposite of love, that we should probably just adopt a separate word to indicate real, authentic love. I don't have a word for that yet, but I'll come up with something brilliant, and then we'll all start using it. Everybody think we're really nuts then. But this overuse and abuse has gotten me thinking, why are we so confused about this concept in the first place? How can people behave in such loveless ways and still think they are demonstrating love? How can someone beat the soup out of their spouse and still say they love them? How can a parent physically and verbally abuse their children and still say they love that child? And on the inside really feel like they do? What is missing? I think it all begins with a fundamental misunderstanding that love is a feeling. I blame evolutionary biology on that one. Without exception, we are fundamentally hardwired to have some sort of feeling for the ones closest to us. It's how we were able to survive against, big mammals that could eat us. So we banded together in little tribes and families. We confuse, though, as we've gone along as a species, we confuse pheromones, hormones, and chemical reactions for love. They aren't love. Now, that isn't to say that we don't learn how to love those closest to us. If there was a category of people who should be easier to love, it's probably those who, through proximity or biology, are closest to us. Thus, we build these tribes to the exclusion of others. The thing is, we're confusing this group identity with love. It's that connection that makes escaping abuse when it happens so hard. No matter what I do to another person or they do to me, as long as we feel love or some sort of connection to them, we love them. No matter how bad it is in this group, it's still us against them. Coincidentally, this is how the cult mindset works. But in the New Testament, we get an alternate feeling for what real love is and what it's supposed to do. Jesus, in the life that he lived in the Gospels, embodied it, and he taught expansively about love. It is the absolute foundation of the kingdom of God. This love, though, isn't necessarily a feeling. Although when we practice love, we can change our pattern of feeling. Love, more than anything else, is an action that leads to a way of being. Real love requires us to do something rather than just feel something. There are prescribed actions that demonstrate love. This is the practice of our faith more than anything else. And y'all know I preach a lot on love. Probably you're rolling your eyes going, oh no, it's another one of Marcus's love sermons. But I think that this is one of those things that I have to teach over and over again because it's so important that we get it right in a world that gets it wrong so much. Now today, through the lectionary reading, because I'm kind of going back with the lectionary for a little while, besides Jesus, Paul, in the rest of the New Testament, taught about it as well. And we're going to look at his perspective. We're in Ephesians chapter 4. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. So here we are, and hold your place there because we're going to read the rest of this little section here in a minute. We're in the middle of the book of Ephesians, and I always like to tell people, remember that context is everything. The letter that Paul is writing to the church at Ephesus, he'd planted the church, he'd been there for 2 or 3 years, and he's trying to take all of these high and noble ideas that we have. You know, I talk about how Jesus, when he talked, he used parables, and parables are infuriating because they're not clear. You know, sometimes I wish Jesus would just say what he meant and meant what he said. But we know that he used parables for a reason. Paul, and I've always had and I talk about my love-hate relationship with Paul. But for Paul, for all of his faults, was a man who liked to explain things clearly. He wanted to make sure people had a real understanding. And he took all of these high and lofty, noble ideas about faith and grace and love, and he said, okay, this is what it looks like on the ground. This is how it works in real life. Because these high and noble ideas that we espouse as Christians are worthless unless they translate into a real concrete action. And Paul knew he was writing to a bunch of new converts who were primarily influenced by a Roman set of values. So in order for these people to really grasp how to live out this kingdom of God, they need real steps laid out before them about what this sacrificial love looked like in real terms. What does love look like lived day in and day out in the context of our everyday running around lives? You know, I shared that before. I said it's all great that we gather here on Sunday and we talk about how much we love each other and all of that kind of stuff. But when we get up on Monday morning and have to do the things that life requires, all of the things, and it doesn't matter whether you work or you're a student or you're retired, I think Monday morning still kind of gives everybody a sense of dread in the pit of their stomach. You know, this summer I've kind of enjoyed it. I've kind of just been working 3 days a week. But tomorrow, you know, I start back working at the school. And I start back first thing Monday morning with junior high kids. And I need that. I need love lived out for real with junior high kids. Because I love them. Because sometimes Jesus tells me to. That's it sometimes. No offense, junior high kids in the audience. Just saying. It takes that. So what does love look like on Monday morning? So this is one of those nuts and bolts sermons. While Jesus' parables sometimes leave us scratching our heads, wondering what he meant, Paul takes the opposite tactic, and he sought to make sure he was explaining things thoroughly. And I've talked about how in the past I really hate some of the things that Paul said. But through our Wednesday night Bible studies, I've come to a new appreciation for the writings of Paul. I used to see him as some misogynistic jerk bent on keeping women in their place and slavers in slavery. But I've come to realize that this has more to do with how people use Paul's words than Paul himself. Paul, as I always remind people, wasn't Jesus. He was a man of his time and his place. So if we peel back some of that frame of reference that he had as a first century Jewish guy trying to explain things to the people around him, we can get a sense of what Paul really meant and get to these timeless truths and ways of being that can influence us even today. His real obsession. And his real obsession was, how do we live this Jesus life together? And it begins for us with 2 words. Speak truth. Now hold on. Before you get all excited about being righteously indignant with people around you, this isn't a license to tell everybody else how they're doing wrong. I mean, that's usually when I think of speaking truth. I'm about to drop some truth on them. I'm going to speak some truth and they're going to hear it. That isn't what Paul is saying. Remember that the goal of the gospel, first and foremost, is to change us. The way of Jesus is self-reflective. In order for it to change us, there has to be a first step. And for Paul, it was to speak the truth about ourselves. This part of the reading, Paul, for all his being a man of his culture, there are still some very, very relevant truths. We, each and every one of us, tend to build a false self. Now, this false self is very self-oriented. Freud and some others call it the ego. And I love that term, ego. because that really describes me and my life most of the time. Because when I think about me and my life, it's my own story about me, right? I mean, when we occupy our own headspace, we think more about ourselves. If you think about other people more than you think about yourselves naturally, then please come up here and preach a sermon, because I need you desperately. But we mostly, it's our own self-narrative. We're thinking about ourselves most of the time. And this ego, it's obsessed with making itself happy. It uses phrases like, whenever we look at something we want to buy or do, or we do something and we want to justify it, we say things like, well, I deserved that, or I deserve to do this. Now, this self is also our public self, a self that we want others to see. One of the funny ironies I find in this hyper-connected world is that the more we are connected, it seems the more we are hell-bent on projecting this false self. As I was writing this sermon on Friday morning, sometimes when I write, I like to kind of watch, when I get a chance, I kind of watch the news while I'm writing. It helps get a perspective. And Friday morning was, it's kind of the last morning before we're all going on our separate ways to school. We were watching the Today Show. And on the Today Show, there's this new kind of, I don't know if you call it a psychological disorder or a phenomenon, but they were airing a piece about there are people who are actually going to plastic surgeons so that they can make themselves look more like their heavily edited images that they use on social media, like Snapchat. The Snapchat filters with your skin, not the weird ones, but like how we edit our face a little bit so we look like the best presentation of ourselves, scrub the blemishes out, even things out, make the real big eye thing, skinny the neck a little bit. Those things. People are going to their plastic surgeon to have themselves look more like this ideal image that they're putting forth on the internet. It's actually termed right now Snapchat dysmorphia. I Googled it just to make sure. I was like, this is a real thing. But this new disorder, I say, it's really just simply playing on an old fear. See, we feel this inherent need to hide our truest selves. We don't want to acknowledge our personal flaws, either physical or personality-wise. But here's the thing. We can't grow as a person. We can't be the person that God is shaping us into until we're willing to throw off this carefully constructed image mask and speak the truth about ourselves to our neighbor. It's why I often choose to share my struggles in this walk from the pulpit. I want to be the example, and I know sometimes I should probably work on my filter because I share too much. But I want you to know that even though I can present all kinds of great images of myself, that I have real problems. I have real problems with pride and greed and narcissism and fairness and grace, as you remember from last week's sermon. I want you to know that sometimes, even for me, faith is a struggle, and it doesn't come easy. See, I want you, my neighbors, to know that about me, because until I speak that truth and own that truth, I can't change. This is what Paul is saying here. Speak the truth about yourself. Now, once we're willing to acknowledge these truths about us, Paul launches into his favorite thing, lists. Remember our Wednesday night Bible study, Paul loves lists. He loves sin lists. He loves, lists of the fruits of the Spirit. He likes to list things out. And he begins with everybody's favorite topic, anger, right? Anger. Now, more specifically, as followers of Jesus, we've got to get our anger under control. See, I think anger is one of our favorite emotions, especially when we feel like we're in the right? I mean, it's always good whenever you feel righteously indignant about something and you can be righteously angry about something. However, in my short experience on this planet, I have never, ever, 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 ever seen any action done in anger, whether it is justified or not, really fix a situation. Ever. Not once. Now, I find this funny because there have been polls conducted which show that in the United States, one of the major perceptions of Christians is that they are always angry. So here we have Paul saying, let go of anger, but the dominant perception of people outside the church is that they're always angry about something. What I find as another irony is that if we're reading Paul here, we should actually be some of the least offendable people on the planet. Even the stuff that other Christians say shouldn't offend us. Another fun fact about anger is I have yet to see an angry person not sin. I mean, Paul is giving this warning. He's like, in your anger, don't sin. But I have never seen it where that sin doesn't end up happening. Even if you are justified in your anger and you are indignant about it, at some point, it takes control of us. Anger is never something that I'm ever able to control. And I can say that as a person, like I've told you about all my other baggage, but I'm not a person that gets angry easily. I mean, I can let a lot of things go. But when I do get angry, oh Lord, it takes me so long to let it go. And so many times whenever I'm dealing with people who make me angry, like I really have to watch myself because I don't yell, I don't scream, I don't curse. But, I'm one of those people that like to get even while smiling at you. It's dangerous. Like I said, you're lucky I don't get angry that often. But it's not an emotion that we as humans really can control or, if I'm being honest, use constructively. Paul goes on to talk about stealing. And he does, and I wonder sometimes if he's not just talking about petty thievery, but the way people take advantage of other people. The wording actually suggests the broader definition here. In other words, when within the body, that is the body of believers, no one takes advantage of anyone else. All contribute to the good of the body. And he goes on from there. Verse 29. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ God forgave you. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love. Just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. The question we must each ask ourselves is, are we building with our words or are we destroying? The most powerful force on the planet is the human voice. See, people commit all kinds of actions based on words, and words are what form our beliefs. And my question to each of us is, do the truths that we so desperately cling to build a more loving, peaceful, and welcoming environment, or do they destroy? See, I admit this is a hard one for me because I am a natural cynic. That's just my nature. When I see a problem, I am quick to think that the ends justify the means. The most direct route is the best. So whenever he was talking about that whole speaking truth to people, that's me, because I have trouble. I'm like, okay, well, I'm just going to tell them the truth and lay it out how it is. And we're going to see how it all lands. It's why I sometimes say I'm not the best counselor. I really try. I'm really working on that. Because, my answer for a lot of problems is pull your head out your rear end and get out of bed and go to work and do your job. Like that's my standard counseling answer. So if you need counseling, you may need to go to somebody who's a little better at that than I am. I'm just putting that out there. I'm trying to do better about it, but that's my answer. I'm like, hey, just do that. There's an old sketch on, it was an old sketch TV show called Mad TV, and Bob Newhart is a therapist in this sketch. And he only charges $5 a session because he says he'll fix you in one session. And it only lasts 5 minutes. And so this person comes in and sits down and pays their $5, and they said, are you sure? And then so she starts laying out her problems of all the things she can do and all the things going on in her life. And he looks at her and he says, stop it! Stop doing that! You realize that's crazy? Stop it! That's his whole way of fixing problems. So that's what I have to deal with sometimes in my own head, because that's why we'll just stop doing it. But here's the deal. If I'm speaking truth about myself and realize that I myself have faults and things that I go through, human interactions are actually very complex, and they're based on all kinds of deep-seated struggles. And that if we are to effect change with people, then it has to be through words and actions that build up, not tear down. People have to face the truth of their actions on their own. They have to face and admit their own truth, realize their own mistakes, their own sin. You cannot force anyone else to face them. You can't force it. There's no way to force that. So Paul goes on with this laundry list of things to get rid of: bitterness, rage, anger, brawling, slander, and all kinds of malice. Now, what it's interesting about this whole thing, if you notice, it seems Paul is writing in a stream of consciousness. Because a few verses ago, he's telling people not to sin in their anger. So it's kind of like as he's spilling all this stuff out, he's thinking about 4 verses later, he essentially says, better yet, just get rid of it. Because you can't not sin in your anger. So just get rid of your anger. It has no real place in your life. Instead, learn the art of compassion and forgiveness. And I use the term art very specifically because it is an art form. It's something that you have to practice at over and over, because compassion, I say that there I go. I'm pretty prideful, so I don't even know if I'm really that compassionate or not. When you orbit your own head a lot, you don't know. But forgiveness, no, that is definitely one I know that is really hard when somebody makes me really angry. Like me letting it go. So it's an art form. It's something I have to do over and over and over again. See, therefore, because of these things, we follow God's example. Now, this following of God is a revolutionary concept, because God, to Paul's pagan audience right now, gods weren't something you followed. Gods were something you feared. Gods were capricious and they were petty, and the whole job of religion was to appease these petty gods in their anger. But not this God. This God came down in the form of Jesus and walked among us and showed us that instead of something to fear, God was a being to be followed. But following this God was radical, because this God broke down the old paradigm of tribalism. This God said crazy things like, turn the other cheek to your enemies and pray for those enemies and love those enemies. That's a little far there, Jesus, I'm just telling you. He also said things like love your neighbor. He divided the camp into 2 worlds, neighbors and enemies, and told you to love them both, which was not helpful. It was much easier to hate your enemy and love whoever you called your neighbor. This worship of God centers around a pursuit of love. Paul is commanding the Ephesians to walk in the way of love. And if I were going to add a verb to love, because I think love is a verb, maybe does it make it an adverb? I don't know. The English, she's not in here, so it doesn't matter. If I'm going to add a concept to love, walking in the way of love is a beautiful concept. It's a great word. It's a great verb, because walking is my favorite form of exercise. If I were to say that I was going to have a favorite form of exercise, I like walking. I hate running. I do it because I have to, but I hate it. So walking, a means to get somewhere. But for Paul's audience, remember that walking isn't just a form of exercise for them. It's the primary means of conveyance around their little world. These are poor people who don't own donkeys or chariots or anything like that. If they wanted to get from point A to point B, they walked. It was just a fact of life. It was something that they did every single day. They didn't even think about it. And if I could think of a concept to describe what love is supposed to be, I think that that's a beautiful description. To walk in the way of love. To be doing something that leads us closer to relationship with each other and with God. And it's an activity that we do every day. An ordinary, everyday thing. See, Paul wanted love to be like that for the Ephesians. It was commonplace, natural, the way the community lived and was understood. So for us, our question is, how do we walk in the way of that love? as we stand and pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I love you so much. And I thank you for this day and this chance to gather here with these people. And my prayer, God, is as we leave this place today, if there's something that we take with us, God, it would be that we look at that phrase, walking in the way of love by following your example. And God, may that be the thing we take with us this week as we leave this place and this time together and have to face a real world tomorrow morning. May we be a people who walk in the way of love. Amen.